Morty begins as an ordinary point of reference in an extraordinary universe. Before portals, before collapsing timelines and disposable realities, his world is small, fragile, and familiar. School, hallways, awkward silences, fear of embarrassment, fear of failure. These are the emotional coordinates that define him. When the multiverse opens, it does not arrive as a philosophical idea or a cosmic abstraction. It arrives as noise, danger, and confusion. From Morty's perspective, infinity is not grand. It is overwhelming. It does not expand the mind so much as it stretches it thin. As the scale of existence explodes outward, Morty remains fundamentally human. His reactions do not scale with the universe around him. Fear does not become heroic simply because the stakes are larger. Loss does not become easier because there are replacements. Each new dimension adds weight rather than wonder. The multiverse introduces a quiet but persistent tension between what Morty is capable of emotionally and what he is forced to endure. That tension never resolves. It only becomes familiar. In a universe where everything exists somewhere, the idea of consequence begins to blur. Morty learns slowly and painfully that no moment is truly unique in the cosmic sense. Every mistake has been made before. Every version of himself exists somewhere else making a slightly different choice. This knowledge does not bring comfort. It introduces doubt. If everything happens anyway, then meaning feels optional, even fragile. Morty's guilt becomes complicated. He feels responsible for actions that, in another universe, barely matter. He carries the emotional cost of events that the multiverse itself shrugs off. The multiverse does not erase Morty's fear, it trains it. Fear becomes routine. Danger loses its sharp edge and turns dull, like a constant background hum. Survival stops feeling like an achievement and starts feeling like an expectation. This is not growth in the heroic sense. It is adaptation. Morty does not become fearless. He becomes tired. The body still reacts, but the mind learns to move forward anyway. Over time, adrenaline gives way to resignation. Loss accumulates quietly. Morty witnesses death not as a singular tragedy, but as a recurring condition of existence. People disappear. Worlds collapse. Versions of loved ones are replaced. There is rarely time to process what is gone before something else demands attention. Grief does not arrive cleanly or fully. It lingers in fragments, unresolved and unnamed. These fragments stack on top of each other, forming a kind of emotional sediment. Morty carries it without ceremony. The most unsettling lesson of the multiverse is not that nothing matters, but that meaning must be chosen in spite of evidence to the contrary. Morty does not articulate this idea, but he lives inside it. He continues to care even when caring hurts. He forms attachments even when he knows they are temporary. This is not naivete. It is resistance. In a reality where detachment is the logical response, Morty's continued emotional investment becomes a quiet act of defiance. Rick's presence intensifies this conflict. From Morty's perspective, Rick is less a person and more a gravitational force. Brilliant, volatile, and emotionally inaccessible, Rick reshapes every space he enters. Morty orbits him, pulled along by intellect and authority he cannot challenge. Rick treats the multiverse as a solved problem. Morty experiences it as a lived trauma. This imbalance defines their relationship. Morty is exposed to ideas and dangers long before he has the tools to process them. Rick's worldview suggests that detachment is survival. Caring leads to pain, and pain is inefficient. Morty feels the weight of this philosophy pressing against his own instincts. He understands it intellectually, but emotionally, he cannot adopt it fully. Each time he tries, something pulls him back. A sense of fairness, a desire to protect, a need to believe that individual moments still count. The friction between these impulses shapes Morty's internal landscape. Over time, Morty's innocence does not disappear. It fractures. Parts of it harden into cynicism. Parts of it retreat inward. Other parts remain strangely intact, preserved by stubbornness rather than ignorance. The multiverse teaches Morty how easily life can be erased, but it also teaches him how rare, genuine connection feels. In infinite realities, familiarity becomes precious. The ordinary moments he once took for granted become anchors. Silence becomes important. Between disasters and absurdity, there are stretches where nothing is demanded of him. In those moments, Morty is left alone with the knowledge of what he has seen. The multiverse feels largest here, not in spectacle, but in absence. The quiet reminds him that there is no final explanation waiting at the end of experience. No cosmic reassurance, just continuation. Morty's sense of self becomes unstable. When there are infinite versions of him, identity stops being singular. He is aware, even if only intuitively, that he is interchangeable on a cosmic scale. This awareness does not erase his individuality, but it undermines its security. He wonders without words, what makes this version of him matter more than another? The question lingers without answer. Despite this, Morty continues to act as though his choices matter. He hesitates, he worries, he hopes. These responses are not logical within an infinite system, but they are human. The multiverse does not take these traits away from him. It tests them. Again and again, Morty is placed in situations where caring is irrational. Again and again, he cares anyway. What the multiverse feels like from Morty's perspective is not freedom. It is exposure. There is nowhere to hide from possibility. Every fear has a version that comes true somewhere. Every regret has a reality where it could have been avoided. Morty exists in constant proximity to what might have been. This proximity is exhausting. It erodes certainty and replaces it with comparison. Yet, there is comfort hidden in this vastness. If nothing is singular, then failure is not final. If pain is universal, then it is not personal. Morty does not consciously draw solace from this idea, but it works on him slowly. The multiverse dilutes shame. It reframes mistakes as part of a larger pattern rather than a personal flaw. In this way, infinity softens some wounds even as it creates others. Morty's growth is uneven. He does not become wiser in a clean, linear way. Some lessons repeat, some scars reopen. The multiverse does not offer closure. It offers continuation. Morty learns to exist within that rhythm. He adapts not by mastering the universe, but by enduring it. What makes Morty compelling is not that he survives cosmic horror, but that he remains emotionally legible within it. He does not become abstract. He does not transcend fear or doubt. The multiverse surrounds him, but it does not fully consume him. His reactions remain grounded in small, human concerns: safety, belonging, approval, love. In the end, the multiverse from Morty's perspective feels less like endless possibility and more like endless responsibility. Not responsibility imposed by logic or destiny, but by empathy. Morty feels what others would rather ignore. He notices the cost of survival. He carries memories that the universe does not preserve. And still, he keeps going. Not because the universe demands it, but because something quieter does. A need to believe that even in infinite realities, a single moment of kindness, fear, or hope can still be real. In the vast indifference of existence, Morty's continued emotional presence becomes its own form of meaning. From Morty's perspective, time inside the multiverse does not move cleanly forward. It folds, repeats, resets, and fractures. Events blur together, not because they lack intensity, but because there is rarely space between them. One catastrophe flows into the next, and memory becomes less about chronology and more about emotional residue. Morty remembers how things felt more than how they happened. Fear, shame, confusion, and occasional relief become landmarks in place of dates or order. The multiverse teaches Morty that survival is not the same as safety. He survives often, but he is rarely secure. There is always another possibility, another version of danger waiting just beyond perception. This constant proximity to threat reshapes his nervous system. Calm becomes conditional. Relaxation feels temporary, something borrowed rather than owned. Even in moments of stillness, part of him remains alert, expecting interruption. What makes this especially heavy is that Morty never asked for this awareness. He did not seek knowledge of infinity or alternate selves. It was imposed on him abruptly, without preparation. As a result, his understanding of the universe is experiential rather than philosophical. He does not debate what infinity means. He feels it pressing against him, crowding his thoughts, dissolving simple explanations. The idea that nothing is permanent becomes personal. Relationships feel fragile because they are. Not just because people can die, but because they can be replaced. The multiverse introduces a subtle cruelty: continuity without uniqueness. Someone can still exist while no longer being the same. Morty feels the dissonance of familiarity without certainty, recognition without trust. This undermines the basic comfort of attachment. Morty learns that grief does not always come from loss, but from replacement. Knowing that a version of someone still exists somewhere else does not heal the absence he feels here. If anything, it sharpens it. The knowledge that what is gone is not gone. Everywhere makes his own experience feel strangely invalid, as though mourning is an overreaction. He carries that confusion quietly. Over time, Morty becomes careful with his emotions, not closed off, but cautious. He senses that caring deeply comes with consequences that others, especially Rick, seem determined to avoid. Morty notices how emotional distance functions as armor. He understands its appeal, but every time he tries to adopt it fully, it feels like a loss of self rather than a gain in control. The multiverse also distorts responsibility. when outcomes branch infinitely, accountability becomes unclear. Morty struggles with the idea that his actions matter when similar actions are playing out endlessly elsewhere. Yet, he cannot shake the feeling that what he does still counts. This tension creates a quiet moral strain. He feels responsible even when logic suggests he does not need to be. This internal conflict often leaves Morty exhausted. Not physically, but ethically. He is constantly negotiating between what makes sense and what feels right. The multiverse encourages detachment, efficiency, and indifference. Morty resists these not because he has a better argument, but because abandoning empathy feels like a deeper failure than any mistake he might make by holding on to it. Morty's sense of agency fluctuates. Sometimes he feels swept along by forces too large to oppose. Other times he feels crushingly aware that his small decisions still ripple outward. This inconsistency is destabilizing. He never knows whether to brace himself or take responsibility. The multiverse does not provide feedback that helps him learn. It simply continues. There is also a subtle loneliness that comes from knowing too much. Morty cannot easily relate his experiences to anyone outside the multiverse. Even within it, Rick's understanding is fundamentally different. Rick intellectualizes infinity. Morty internalizes it. This difference isolates Morty even when he is not physically alone. His fears and doubts feel unshareable, too abstract for ordinary language. Moments of normalcy become surreal. Everyday concerns feel both trivial and precious. Morty is aware of how easily they can be erased, which gives them weight but also fragility. He enjoys them cautiously, as though they might dissolve if held too tightly. This careful appreciation becomes part of his emotional rhythm. The multiverse strips away the illusion of destiny. Nothing is meant to happen. Everything simply does. Morty senses this absence of narrative structure. There is no arc guiding him toward resolution or reward. This realization is quietly devastating. Without destiny, meaning must be constructed moment by moment. Morty does this instinctively, even when it hurts. Fear changes shape over time. Early fear is sharp and immediate. Later fear is broader and less defined. It becomes anxiety about patterns rather than events. Morty worries not just about what might happen, but about what always seems to happen. This pattern recognition creates a low-level dread that never fully leaves. Despite this, Morty still experiences hope. Not the grand hope of changing the universe, but the small hope of temporary peace. A moment without danger. A connection that lasts a little longer than expected. These hopes are modest, almost fragile, but they are real. They give Morty something to move toward rather than merely away from. The multiverse also forces Morty to confront versions of himself he does not like. He becomes aware that under different circumstances, he could be crueler, colder, more willing to accept harm. This awareness is unsettling. It suggests that his current values are not guaranteed. They are contingent. Morty holds on to them anyway, knowing how easily they could slip. What Morty ultimately learns is not how to conquer infinity, but how to exist inside it without disappearing emotionally. He does not emerge stronger in a triumphant sense. He emerges altered, uneven, and more aware of his own limits. The multiverse does not reward him for this. It does not acknowledge his effort. His endurance is invisible at scale. From the outside, Morty's story might look like desensitization. From the inside, it feels more like survival through selective vulnerability. He learns where to harden and where to remain open. This balance is imperfect and constantly shifting. Sometimes he gets it wrong, sometimes the cost is high. What remains consistent is Morty's refusal to fully detach. In a universe that treats individuals as interchangeable, his insistence on personal meaning becomes significant. Not because it changes the multiverse, but because it preserves something within him. He continues to react, to care, to hesitate. These are not weaknesses in his experience. They are anchors. The multiverse, from Morty's perspective, is not an adventure. It is a condition, something he lives inside rather than travels through. It shapes him quietly, continuously, without clear milestones. There is no final understanding waiting for him, no moment where infinity makes sense. There is only adjustment, and within that adjustment, Morty continues to choose presence over absence, feeling over numbness, engagement over withdrawal. These choices do not resolve his fear or confusion. They simply allow him to remain himself, even as the universe insists that selfhood is optional. There is a subtle shift that happens to Morty over time, one that is easy to miss because it does not announce itself through dramatic change. It is a slow recalibration of expectation. Early on, Morty reacts to the multiverse as something abnormal, something that violates the rules of how reality should behave. Eventually, that distinction erodes. The abnormal becomes routine, and the idea of a stable, predictable world begins to feel theoretical rather than remembered. This does not make Morty more comfortable. It makes him more careful. Certainty disappears first. Morty learns that explanations rarely hold for long. Rules change depending on the universe, the technology involved, or Rick's mood. Patterns that once felt reliable dissolve without warning. As a result, Morty stops trusting conclusions. He hesitates before believing that a problem is solved or that a moment of peace will last. This hesitation becomes part of his mental posture, a way of bracing himself against disappointment. The multiverse also alters Morty's relationship with morality. Right and wrong no longer feel absolute when consequences vary infinitely. Actions that feel unforgivable in one context are irrelevant in another. Morty senses this erosion of moral clarity, and it troubles him. He wants rules that apply consistently, not because they are efficient, but because they provide orientation. Without them, he must rely on intuition, and intuition becomes strained under constant pressure. This strain shows up in small ways. Morty second-guesses himself. He pauses longer before acting. He carries regret preemptively, as though anticipating that whatever he chooses will lead to harm somewhere. The multiverse does not punish decisiveness, but it does not reward it either. Every choice exists alongside countless alternatives, making satisfaction difficult to sustain. Morty learns that even correct decisions can feel hollow when their uniqueness is erased. There is also a growing awareness of replaceability. Morty knows that if he disappears, the universe will not notice. Another version will fill the space seamlessly. This knowledge does not produce despair in a dramatic sense. It produces quiet detachment from the idea of legacy. Morty stops imagining a future where his actions are remembered or matter at scale. Instead, meaning collapses inward, becoming personal and immediate. This inward focus changes how Morty experiences time. Long-term goals feel less compelling when the future itself feels untouchable. Short-term relief becomes more valuable than distant achievement. Moments of safety, however brief, are prioritized over abstract success. This is not laziness or lack of ambition. It is adaptation to a world where permanence cannot be assumed. The multiverse also introduces a strange form of humility. Morty is constantly reminded of how small he is, not just physically, but narratively. He is not central to the universe's functioning. Events do not revolve around his growth or understanding. This realization could easily lead to nihilism, but for Morty, it more often leads to restraint. He becomes less inclined to assert himself forcefully, more aware of unintended consequences. At the same time, Morty develops a sharper sensitivity to suffering. Exposure does not numb him completely. Instead, it heightens his awareness of how casually pain is produced and dismissed. He notices when damage is treated as background noise. This awareness makes it harder for him to ignore harm, even when ignoring it would be easier. The multiverse normalizes destruction. Morty resists that normalization instinctively. There is a paradox here. Morty is surrounded by chaos, yet he becomes increasingly drawn to order, even if it is fragile or temporary. He seeks moments where things align, where actions have clear outcomes, where people behave predictably. These moments are rare, but when they occur, they stand out sharply against the surrounding uncertainty. Morty clings to them not because they are perfect, but because they are comprehensible. His relationship with Rick remains central to this experience. Rick embodies the multiverse's indifference. He treats complexity as a puzzle already solved, emotions as inefficiencies to be minimized. Morty exists in constant contrast to this approach. He feels the cost of Rick's detachment without fully rejecting Rick himself. This creates a complicated emotional bind. Morty relies on Rick for survival, even as Rick's worldview threatens to erode the parts of Morty that make survival meaningful. Morty's attempts to assert boundaries are often tentative. He lacks the authority, confidence, and leverage to enforce them consistently. When he does push back, the effort is draining. The multiverse does not pause to acknowledge his resistance. Rick does not always recognize it as significant. Still, these moments matter internally. They reinforce Morty's sense that he is not entirely passive, even when overwhelmed. The concept of self becomes fluid. Morty is aware that his personality is not fixed, that different experiences could push him in drastically different directions. This awareness makes identity feel provisional. He does not assume that who he is now will remain intact. This fragility adds urgency to his choices. If selfhood can dissolve, then preserving it becomes an active process rather than a given. Morty's emotional life becomes layered. Surface reactions coexist with deeper undercurrents of fear, guilt, and cautious hope. He learns to function while carrying unresolved feelings. Resolution is rare. Instead, emotions fade, resurface, and transform without clear endpoints. The multiverse does not provide closure. Morty adapts by learning to live without it. There is also a subtle shift in how Morty understands courage. Early courage looks like facing danger despite fear. Later courage looks like remaining emotionally open despite evidence that openness leads to pain. This form of courage is quieter and less visible. It does not produce dramatic victories. It simply prevents complete withdrawal. Morty practices it daily, often without recognizing it as such. As his exposure increases, Morty becomes more selective about what he reacts to. This selectivity is not apathy. It is triage. He cannot afford to emotionally process everything. Some events pass through him with minimal impact, not because they do not matter, but because he lacks the capacity to absorb them fully. This selective engagement allows him to continue functioning, though it leaves behind unexamined residue. Despite everything, Morty retains an ability to be surprised. Not by spectacle, but by sincerity, genuine kindness, unexpected loyalty, or moments of shared vulnerability still affect him deeply. These moments stand out precisely because they are not guaranteed by the multiverse. They feel earned, fragile, and therefore valuable. Morty holds on to them as evidence that not everything is interchangeable. The multiverse challenges the idea that growth leads to clarity. Morty does not gain a comprehensive understanding of existence. Instead, he gains familiarity with uncertainty. This familiarity does not eliminate discomfort. It simply makes it livable. Morty learns how to move forward without full understanding, how to act without assurance that his actions will matter beyond the moment. From Morty's perspective, the multiverse is less about infinite possibilities and more about infinite exposure to contingency. Nothing has to happen the way it does. That realization destabilizes narratives of purpose and reward. Morty responds by grounding himself in experience rather than explanation. What he feels, what he sees, what he chooses in the moment becomes more real than abstract meaning. This grounding is imperfect and fragile. Morty still falters. He still doubts. He still wishes for simplicity that no longer feels accessible, but he continues to participate. He continues to feel. In a universe that does not require this of him, that indifference becomes significant. The multiverse does not resolve Morty. It does not transform him into something beyond human. Instead, it exposes the limits of human endurance and then forces him to live within those limits anyway. Morty's story is not one of transcendence, but of persistence. What the multiverse ultimately feels like from Morty's perspective is a constant negotiation between scale and intimacy, between knowing that nothing is unique and feeling that something still is. Morty lives inside that contradiction. He does not solve it. He carries it. And in carrying it, he maintains a quiet presence that the multiverse itself does not acknowledge, but that defines his experience within Rick and Morty. As Morty continues moving through the multiverse, his relationship with knowledge changes in a fundamental way. Early exposure creates a hunger to understand what is happening, to find rules that make the chaos manageable. Over time, that hunger fades, replaced by a cautious distance from explanation itself. Understanding does not consistently lead to control, and sometimes it only deepens unease. Morty begins to sense that knowing more is not always protective. Some truths increase vulnerability rather than reduce it. The multiverse removes the comfort of ignorance without offering the stability of certainty. Morty becomes aware of systems too large to influence and patterns too vast to escape. This awareness does not empower him, it humbles him. He learns that comprehension does not guarantee agency. One can understand exactly how fragile reality is and still be unable to prevent it from breaking. This realization reshapes his expectations of himself. He stops measuring worth by effectiveness. With this shift comes a quieter form of acceptance, not resignation, but an acknowledgement of limitation. Morty understands that he cannot fix the universe, and eventually, he stops feeling obligated to try. This does not make him careless. It makes him selective. He focuses on what is immediately in front of him rather than what stretches infinitely outward. This narrowing of attention is not denial, it is survival. The multiverse also alters Morty's perception of danger. Threats are no longer singular events, but recurring conditions. He does not fear one catastrophe so much as the certainty that another will follow. This creates a background tension that never fully dissipates. Morty learns to function within that tension, carrying it quietly rather than reacting to it loudly. Fear becomes integrated rather than episodic. In this environment, emotional extremes flatten. Triumph feels muted because it is temporary. Defeat feels less final because it is repeatable. Morty exists in a middle range of feeling more often than not. This emotional compression is subtle but profound. It does not eliminate feeling, but it limits its amplitude. Intense joy and intense despair become harder to sustain when both feel provisional. Despite this flattening, certain experiences still break through. Moments of moral clarity, however rare, resonate strongly. When Morty recognizes a choice that aligns cleanly with his values, the relief is noticeable. These moments stand out because they are uncomplicated. They do not require multiversal justification. They feel right without explanation. Morty learns to treasure these moments, not because they solve anything, but because they momentarily simplify existence. The concept of fairness becomes increasingly abstract. Morty sees outcomes that are wildly disproportionate to actions. Kindness does not guarantee safety. Cruelty does not always result in consequence. The multiverse does not enforce moral balance. This absence is disorienting. Morty wants the universe to respond appropriately, to reward care and punish harm. Instead, it responds arbitrarily. Morty adapts by internalizing fairness rather than expecting it externally. This internalization is costly. When the universe does not enforce consequences, Morty feels pressure to do so emotionally. He carries guilt where none is demanded. He holds himself accountable even when no one else does. This self-imposed responsibility is exhausting, but it preserves a sense of coherence. Without it, Morty risks drifting into the same indifference that surrounds him. Over time, Morty becomes more aware of how easily empathy can be eroded. He sees how exposure normalizes harm, how repetition dulls response. He feels this erosion happening within himself and resists it consciously. This resistance is not always successful. Sometimes he fails. Sometimes he looks away. The difference is that he notices when it happens. Awareness becomes a form of accountability. The multiverse also complicates Morty's sense of trust. When reality itself is unstable, promises lose weight. Continuity cannot be assumed. Morty learns to trust provisionally, to remain open while anticipating disruption. This conditional trust is fragile. It allows connection, but it also prevents full relaxation. Morty is present, but never entirely unguarded. There is a quiet grief associated with this state, not grief for a specific loss, but for the idea of safety that no longer feels accessible. Morty remembers faintly a time when the world felt smaller and more predictable. That memory becomes less detailed over time, more impression than recollection. He does not dwell on it, but its absence shapes his expectations. He no longer assumes that peace is the default. The multiverse reshapes Morty's relationship with choice. Choice exists everywhere, but its significance feels diluted. When every option is realized somewhere, choosing feels less definitive. Morty struggles with this. He wants choices to matter, to close off alternatives. Instead, they coexist endlessly. Morty responds by focusing on intention rather than outcome. What he means to do becomes more important than what ultimately happens. This shift toward intention is subtle but stabilizing. It allows Morty to reclaim a sense of agency that does not depend on results. He cannot control the multiverse, but he can control how he approaches moments within it. This approach does not guarantee satisfaction, but it provides orientation. Morty learns to value alignment over success. As his exposure continues, Morty becomes increasingly sensitive to emotional dissonance. He notices when humor masks cruelty, when excitement disguises harm. The show's chaos often presents destruction as spectacle. Morty experiences it as consequence. This difference in perception isolates him. He feels out of sync with the tone of the universe around him. What is framed as absurd often feels heavy from his vantage point. This mismatch deepens Morty's internal conflict. He wants to belong, to participate without reservation. Yet, his awareness prevents full immersion. He cannot unsee what he has seen. This creates a sense of partial presence. Morty is there, but also observing himself being there. This self-awareness adds another layer of distance. The multiverse also disrupts Morty's sense of growth. Progress feels inconsistent. Lessons are learned and then challenged again. There is no final mastery. Morty understands that improvement does not move in a straight line. He becomes more forgiving of regression, both in himself and others. Setbacks feel inevitable rather than shameful. At the same time, Morty develops a clearer sense of what he does not want to become. He sees versions of behavior that repel him, attitudes that feel empty or cruel. These observations function as boundaries. Even when Morty is uncertain about his direction, he knows what he is moving away from. This negative clarity becomes a guide when positive certainty is unavailable. Morty's emotional endurance is tested repeatedly, not through singular trauma, but through accumulation. Each experience adds a small weight, individually manageable, collectively heavy. Morty carries this weight without ceremony. There is no moment where he sets it down. He adjusts to it, redistributing it across his emotional life so that no single part collapses. In rare moments of reflection, Morty senses how much he has changed. Not in visible ways, but internally. His reactions are slower. His expectations are lower. His attachments are more cautious. This awareness does not come with pride or regret. It simply registers as fact. change has occurred regardless of intention. The multiverse also challenges Morty's understanding of love. Attachment becomes risky when permanence is uncertain. Yet Morty continues to form bonds. These bonds are not naive. They are conditional, aware of fragility. Morty loves with an understanding of loss built in. This does not diminish the love. It alters its texture, making it quieter and more careful. What Morty ultimately experiences is not despair, but a sustained ambiguity. The multiverse does not crush him outright. It wears him down gradually. In response, Morty learns to pace himself emotionally. He stops expecting resolution. He stops demanding coherence from a system that does not provide it. Instead, he learns to exist alongside uncertainty without surrendering entirely to it. This coexistence is the core of Morty's experience. He does not overcome the multiverse. He negotiates with it daily. Some days he gives more ground than others. Some days he holds firm. There is no final balance, only ongoing adjustment. From Morty's perspective, the multiverse is not a puzzle to be solved or a frontier to be conquered. It is an environment that reshapes those within it. Morty is reshaped slowly, unevenly, and without consent. What remains remarkable is not that he changes, but that something consistent persists beneath those changes. That consistency is not strength in the traditional sense. It is responsiveness. Morty continues to register the world around him, to be affected by it. He does not fully insulate himself, even when insulation would be easier. In a universe that does not require sensitivity, Morty's continued sensitivity becomes its own quiet statement. The multiverse may be infinite, indifferent, and repetitive, but Morty's experience of it is finite, personal, and cumulative. Each moment adds to an internal narrative that the universe does not record. That narrative exists only because Morty carries it. And within the vast, uncaring structure of Rick and Morty, that private accumulation of feeling is what gives Morty's perspective its weight. As Morty remains immersed in the multiverse, the idea of belonging becomes increasingly complex. Early on, belonging was tied to place, routine, and familiarity. Home was not perfect, but it was stable enough to provide orientation. The multiverse dissolves this stability. Locations are interchangeable, realities are disposable, and the concept of home loses its physical anchor. Morty begins to understand belonging not as a location, but as a temporary alignment of people, moments, and emotional states. This shift creates a subtle loneliness. Morty is rarely alone in a literal sense, yet he often feels unaccompanied internally. The people around him may share space but not experience. His exposure to the multiverse places him out of sync with ordinary concerns. Conversations feel shallow, not because they lack value, but because they do not reach the depth of what he carries. Morty learns to compartmentalize, to maintain parallel internal worlds that rarely overlap. The multiverse also reframes memory. Memories lose their sense of permanence when entire timelines can be abandoned. Morty remembers events that no longer belong to the reality he occupies. These memories feel real, but they lack external validation. No one else remembers them. This creates a quiet dissonance. Morty's past becomes partially invisible, known only to him. Memory shifts from shared history to private burden. This invisibility affects how Morty understands himself. Identity is often reinforced through recognition by others. When experiences cannot be shared or confirmed, they begin to feel unreal, even to the person who lived them. Morty occasionally questions the solidity of his own memories, not because they are false, but because they are unacknowledged. The multiverse teaches him that reality does not require witnesses to move on. As a result, Morty develops a restrained relationship with his own past. He does not revisit memories often. Dwelling offers little comfort when there is no continuity to connect past to present. Instead, he allows memories to settle quietly, influencing him indirectly. They shape his reactions and expectations without becoming explicit reference points. The past becomes atmospheric rather than narrative. The future undergoes a similar transformation. Long-term anticipation feels unstable when timelines branch endlessly. Morty stops imagining specific outcomes. He no longer projects himself confidently forward. Instead, the future becomes an open space, defined by uncertainty rather than aspiration. This does not eliminate hope entirely, but it narrows it. Hope becomes less about achievement and more about survival, with integrity intact. Within this narrowing, Morty's values become simpler, though not easier. He gravitates toward principles that do not depend on scale. Kindness, restraint, honesty. These values hold regardless of universe. They do not promise reward, but they offer consistency. Morty relies on them as internal reference points when external structures fail. They become portable forms of meaning. The multiverse constantly challenges these values. Situations arise where kindness is inefficient, restraint is risky, and honesty has no effect. Morty experiences these conflicts repeatedly. He does not always choose well by his own standards. Sometimes he compromises, sometimes he freezes. What matters is not consistency of action, but persistence of concern. Morty continues to care about alignment even when he cannot maintain it. This concern manifests as quiet self-reflection rather than dramatic regret. Morty does not collapse under guilt. He absorbs it, adjusts slightly, and moves on. The multiverse does not pause to allow emotional processing, so Morty adapts by processing incrementally. Feelings are digested in fragments, spread across time. This prevents emotional overload, but it also means resolution is rare. Another consequence of multiversal exposure is Morty's evolving relationship with fear. Fear becomes less reactive and more anticipatory. He worries less about immediate threats and more about patterns repeating. This anticipatory fear lacks a clear target. It is diffuse, harder to resolve, and more draining. Morty learns to live alongside it rather than attempting to eliminate it. In this environment, calm becomes a practice state rather than a natural one. Morty learns how to appear relaxed even when internally alert. This is not deception, it is regulation. The multiverse demands composure, and Morty develops it gradually. His outward demeanor stabilizes, even as his internal world remains complex. This creates a visible quietness that can be mistaken for detachment. Despite this, Morty remains emotionally permeable. Certain experiences bypass his defenses entirely. Witnessing vulnerability in others, especially when unguarded or unexpected, affects him deeply. These moments remind him that emotional openness still exists, even in a universe that discourages it. Morty responds to these moments instinctively. without calculation. The multiverse also reshapes Morty's understanding of failure. Failure loses its finality when consequences are reversible or replicated elsewhere. Yet failure does not become meaningless. Instead, it becomes instructive in a different way. Morty learns less from outcomes and more from internal response. How he feels after a failure matters more than the failure itself. This internal metric replaces external evaluation. This shift allows Morty to maintain a sense of self, even when external circumstances invalidate effort. He cannot control whether actions succeed, but he can observe whether they align with who he wants to be. This observation becomes a stabilizing force. It does not eliminate disappointment, but it prevents disintegration. Morty's relationship with control also evolves. Early experiences foster a desire to influence events, to prevent harm through action. Over time, he recognizes the limits of intervention. Control becomes selective. Morty intervenes where he feels personally implicated and withdraws where involvement would only amplify harm. This discernment is imperfect, but it reflects growth under constraint. The multiverse exposes Morty to extremes of behavior. He sees cruelty without motive and kindness without reward. These extremes clarify his preferences. Morty becomes less tolerant of indifference, even when it is framed as rational. He senses that emotional withdrawal, while protective, carries its own cost. He weighs this cost continuously, choosing vulnerability in measured doses. As exposure continues, Morty's emotional range becomes more nuanced. He distinguishes between exhaustion and despair, between fear and caution, between detachment and rest. These distinctions allow him to respond more accurately to his own state. Self-awareness increases not as insight, but as familiarity. He recognizes patterns within himself, even when he cannot change them immediately. The multiverse does not provide Morty with closure, but it does provide perspective. He becomes less shocked by imperfection, less surprised by disappointment. This reduced reactivity is not apathy, it is calibration. Morty adjusts expectations to match reality as he experiences it, rather than as he wishes it to be. Yet, within this calibration, Morty preserves a quiet longing for simplicity, not ignorance, but coherence. He wishes for moments where cause and effect align clearly, where actions have visible meaning. These moments are rare, but when they occur, they resonate deeply. Morty experiences them as reminders that coherence is possible, even if not guaranteed. The multiverse also complicates Morty's relationship with himself. He knows he is capable of change, both positive and negative. This knowledge creates vigilance. Morty monitors his own reactions, watching for signs of hardening or indifference. When he notices these signs, he experiences concern rather than panic. Awareness becomes a checkpoint, not a judgment. As time passes, Morty's internal life grows quieter, but denser. Thoughts slow, but feelings accumulate. He becomes less expressive outwardly, but more reflective inwardly. This inwardness is not withdrawal. It is a way of maintaining continuity when external continuity cannot be relied upon. Morty's experience of the multiverse is ultimately defined by endurance rather than resolution. He does not arrive at a stable understanding of existence. He learns how to remain present within instability. This presence is active, not passive. It requires ongoing adjustment, self-monitoring, and choice. What the multiverse feels like from Morty's perspective is not awe or terror in isolation, but a sustained mixture of familiarity and unease. Infinity becomes ordinary without becoming comfortable. Morty adapts to this condition without normalizing it entirely. He accepts its reality while refusing to let it fully define his values. Within the structure of Rick and Morty, Morty's perspective provides a counterweight to cosmic indifference. He does not argue against it or defeat it, he simply continues to feel within it. That feeling, persistent and unresolved, becomes the most consistent feature of his experience. In a universe where everything can be replaced, Morty's continued emotional presence is not dramatic or revolutionary. It is quiet, ongoing, and easily overlooked. Yet it is precisely this understated persistence that defines how the multiverse feels to him. Not as an idea to be understood, but as a condition to be lived through, one moment at a time. As Morty continues existing within the multiverse, his perception of reality becomes increasingly layered. Reality is no longer a single stable surface, but a stack of impressions, each shaped by experience rather than confirmation. He does not assume that what he sees now will remain consistent, and this assumption quietly alters how he engages with the world. He interacts gently, almost cautiously, as though pressing too hard might cause things to fracture. This caution does not come from fear alone. It comes from familiarity with collapse. Morty has seen how easily environments dissolve, how quickly situations spiral beyond control. Over time, this knowledge rewires his expectations. He stops assuming durability. Instead, he treats stability as temporary, something to be respected rather than relied upon. This mindset does not make him passive, it makes him deliberate. The multiverse also reshapes Morty's relationship with attention. When everything is potentially significant, focus becomes a scarce resource. Morty cannot afford to attend fully to every threat, every anomaly, every emotional signal. He learns to narrow his awareness, not out of indifference, but out of necessity. This selective attention allows him to remain functional, but it also creates gaps. Some things pass by unnoticed, not because they are unimportant, but because capacity is limited. These gaps become part of Morty's internal landscape. He senses that there are experiences he has not fully processed, moments that slipped past him emotionally. Rather than trying to recover them, he accepts their absence. The multiverse does not allow for complete accounting. Morty adapts by letting some things remain unresolved. This acceptance is not peaceful, but it is sustainable. As exposure continues, Morty's understanding of normalcy evolves. Normal is no longer defined by absence of danger, but by familiarity of response. If he knows how he will react, the situation feels manageable, even if it is objectively extreme. This redefinition of normal shifts the threshold for comfort. Morty can remain calm in environments that would have once overwhelmed him, not because they are safer, but because he has rehearsed the emotional terrain. This rehearsal is not conscious. It emerges from repetition. Patterns imprint themselves on Morty's reactions, shaping reflexes and expectations. Over time, He becomes less surprised by chaos and more surprised by quiet. Calm moments feel unusual, almost suspicious. Morty learns to enjoy them carefully, aware that they may not last. The multiverse also affects Morty's sense of narrative. Stories usually imply progression, lessons, and resolution. Morty's experience resists this structure. Events do not build toward closure. Consequences are inconsistent. Lessons are learned and then rendered irrelevant by new conditions. Morty gradually releases the expectation that experiences will make sense in retrospect. Meaning becomes provisional, contextual, and often incomplete. This shift has emotional consequences. Without narrative payoff, suffering feels less justified. Morty does not endure hardship with the belief that it will lead to something better. He endures because stopping is not an option. This endurance is not heroic, it is pragmatic. Morty learns to exist without the promise of reward. At the same time, the absence of narrative frees Morty from certain pressures. He does not need to become a better version of himself according to some cosmic arc. Growth becomes subtle and uneven. He changes in response to immediate demands rather than long-term ideals. This makes his development less visible, but more authentic. Morty becomes shaped by experience rather than aspiration. The multiverse also complicates Morty's emotional vocabulary. Some feelings no longer fit neatly into categories. Fear blends with anticipation. Sadness overlaps with acceptance. Relief carries traces of guilt. Morty senses these mixtures without always naming them. Emotional clarity becomes less important than emotional navigation. He learns how to move through feeling without fully defining it. This navigation requires restraint. Morty becomes careful about emotional expression, not because he wants to hide, but because expression does not always lead to understanding. He has learned that sharing does not guarantee connection. Sometimes it produces confusion or dismissal. Morty chooses silence selectively, preserving energy rather than seeking validation. Despite this restraint, Morty does not become emotionally closed. He remains receptive. When others express vulnerability, he responds instinctively. These moments bypass his caution. They feel rare and therefore significant. Morty treats them with care, aware of how easily they can be damaged. The multiverse also alters Morty's perception of risk. Risk is no longer defined solely by physical danger. Emotional risk becomes equally significant. Caring deeply, trusting, or hoping can lead to pain that is difficult to recover from. Morty learns to weigh these risks carefully. He does not avoid them entirely, but he engages with awareness of potential cost. This awareness shapes Morty's relationships. He forms connections that are meaningful but measured. He does not rush intimacy, nor does he dismiss it. He allows bonds to develop slowly, with an understanding of fragility built in. This approach does not prevent loss, but it makes loss less disorienting. As Morty matures within the multiverse, his understanding of responsibility shifts again. Responsibility becomes less about fixing outcomes and more about honoring process. He cannot control what happens, but he can control how he participates. This participation becomes the core of his ethical framework. Morty judges himself less by success and more by sincerity. This internal standard provides stability when external feedback is unreliable. The multiverse does not reward good intentions consistently, but Morty finds value in maintaining them anyway. This choice is quiet and ongoing. It does not resolve his doubts or eliminate his fear. It simply gives him a way to continue. Morty also becomes more attuned to the emotional cost of detachment. He observes how indifference simplifies decision-making, but impoverishes experience. While detachment offers protection, it also narrows the range of feeling. Morty senses this narrowing as a loss. He resists it, not out of principle, but out of instinct. He wants to remain affected even when being affected hurts. This resistance requires effort. The multiverse encourages numbness through repetition. Morty counters this by noticing details, small changes in tone, subtle shifts in behavior, moments of hesitation. Attention becomes a way of staying engaged. By noticing, Morty affirms presence. Presence for Morty is not about control or understanding. It is about staying emotionally available in a context that discourages availability. This presence fluctuates. Some days he withdraws more than others. Some days he feels distant even from himself. The important thing is that he notices these fluctuations rather than ignoring them. The multiverse also affects Morty's relationship with uncertainty. Early uncertainty produces anxiety. Later uncertainty becomes familiar. Morty does not like it, but he no longer expects it to disappear. This acceptance reduces panic but not concern. He remains alert without being overwhelmed. This balance is fragile and requires constant adjustment. As time passes, Morty's internal pace slows. He reacts less impulsively. He pauses, considers, and then acts. This slowing is not hesitation born of fear. It is calibration. Morty learns that immediate reaction often worsens situations. Pausing allows space for better alignment, even if outcomes remain unpredictable. This slower pace creates a contrast with the speed of the multiverse itself. Events escalate quickly. Decisions are demanded rapidly. Consequences unfold without warning. Morty exists slightly out of sync with this tempo. He lags just enough to feel the weight of what is happening. This lag is uncomfortable, but it preserves awareness. The multiverse also teaches Morty about limits. Not everything can be endured indefinitely. Morty experiences exhaustion that is not relieved by rest. This exhaustion is emotional and accumulative. He manages it by lowering expectations, simplifying goals, and allowing himself moments of disengagement. These moments are not failures, they are maintenance. Maintenance becomes an essential concept. Morty learns that staying intact requires ongoing care. He cannot rely on momentum or resilience alone. He must monitor his state, adjust his exposure, and occasionally retreat. This self-care is quiet and often unnoticed. It does not look like strength, but it is. Through all of this, Morty's sense of self remains provisional but persistent. He does not cling to a fixed identity. He allows himself to change. At the same time, he maintains certain internal commitments. These commitments are not rigid rules, but guiding tendencies. They orient him when clarity is absent. The multiverse does not provide Morty with answers about purpose or meaning. It offers scale without guidance. Morty responds by grounding meaning in experience rather than explanation. What he feels in a moment, how he treats others, how he responds to harm. These become the metrics by which he navigates existence. From Morty's perspective, The multiverse is not a revelation. It is an environment that reshapes perception over time. It does not demand understanding, only adaptation. Morty adapts not by becoming harder or more detached, but by becoming more selective, more aware, and more deliberate. Within the vast, indifferent structure of Rick and Morty, Morty's experience unfolds quietly. There is no culmination, no final insight that resolves the tension between infinity and individuality. There is only continuation. What remains consistent is Morty's ongoing negotiation with scale. He exists at the intersection of the infinite and the intimate. He knows how small he is, and he feels how much that smallness still contains. The multiverse does not validate this feeling. It does not need to. Morty continues anyway, not because he believes it will lead somewhere, but because presence itself becomes his form of meaning. In a universe where everything can be replaced, the act of continuing to feel, to notice, and to care becomes quietly significant. As Morty remains within the multiverse, his awareness of repetition deepens. Not repetition in the mechanical sense, but emotional repetition. The same tensions return in altered forms. The same dilemmas resurface with different faces. Morty begins to recognize these patterns not as failures to learn, but as conditions of existence. The multiverse does not evolve toward resolution. It cycles. Morty adapts by expecting recurrence rather than closure. This expectation changes how he relates to disappointment. Early disappointment carried a sense of surprise, as though things were not supposed to unfold that way. Over time, disappointment loses its shock. It still hurts, but it no longer destabilizes. Morty experiences it as confirmation rather than contradiction. This does not make him pessimistic, it makes him calibrated. He no longer builds emotional structures on the assumption that outcomes will be favorable. The multiverse also reshapes Morty's relationship with effort. Effort does not reliably correlate with results. Careful actions can lead to harm. Reckless actions can succeed. This inconsistency weakens the incentive to strive for perfection. Morty learns to aim for sufficiency instead, doing enough rather than doing everything. This recalibration protects him from exhaustion while allowing continued engagement. Within this framework, Morty becomes more forgiving of himself. Not indulgent, but realistic. He recognizes that limitations are not moral failures. The multiverse exposes him to scenarios that exceed any reasonable capacity to respond optimally. Morty internalizes this exposure. He stops expecting himself to be adequate for infinity. Instead, he measures adequacy locally, moment by moment. The sense of scale remains ever present. Morty is aware, at all times, that his perspective is narrow. This awareness does not invalidate his experience, but it contextualizes it. He knows that what feels overwhelming to him may be negligible at a cosmic level. Rather than diminishing his feelings, this contrast intensifies them. It highlights how disproportionate emotional experience can be relative to external significance. This disproportion creates a unique kind of vulnerability. Morty feels deeply in situations that the universe treats lightly. Destruction is normalized. Loss is procedural. Morty's emotional reactions do not align with the universe's indifference. This misalignment isolates him. He exists out of phase with his environment. responding with gravity where none is required. The multiverse does not correct this misalignment. It does not offer validation or reassurance. Morty adapts by becoming his own witness. He acknowledges his reactions internally even when they are unrecognized externally. This self-witnessing becomes essential. Without it, his experiences risk dissolving into unreality. As time passes, Morty becomes increasingly aware of emotional thresholds. There are limits beyond which further exposure would not deepen understanding, only increase harm. He learns to recognize when disengagement is necessary. This disengagement is not escape, it is containment. Morty withdraws selectively, preserving capacity for moments that matter most to him. These moments are often small: a pause before action, a decision not to escalate, a choice to protect rather than dominate. The multiverse does not highlight these moments. They are easily overlooked. Morty experiences them as quiet affirmations. They remind him that agency still exists, even if its impact is limited. The concept of impact itself changes. Morty no longer expects to leave lasting marks on the universe. He shifts focus toward immediate influence, how his actions affect those directly involved, how they affect him. This localized sense of impact becomes meaningful precisely because it does not rely on permanence. The multiverse also alters Morty's perception of knowledge accumulation. Knowing more does not necessarily lead to clarity. Sometimes it complicates decision-making. Morty becomes cautious about seeking answers. He senses that some questions expand faster than their answers can contain. Rather than chasing comprehensive understanding, he prioritizes functional understanding, enough to act without being paralyzed. This pragmatism does not eliminate curiosity. It tempers it. Morty remains curious, but selectively. He engages with questions that feel relevant to immediate experience. Larger abstractions recede into the background. This does not make him shallow. It makes him grounded. Grounding becomes increasingly important. Morty learns to anchor himself in sensory experience when conceptual overwhelm threatens. Physical sensations, simple routines, familiar environments. These anchors provide stability when intellectual frameworks fail. The multiverse cannot destabilize what is immediately felt. Morty relies on this fact more often than he realizes. There is also a shift in how Morty understands strength. Strength is no longer associated with dominance, control, or endurance alone. It becomes associated with regulation, the ability to remain responsive without being consumed, the ability to pause rather than react. Morty practices this form of strength unevenly, but persistently. The multiverse challenges this practice constantly. Situations arise that demand rapid response. Morty sometimes reverts to instinct, sometimes freezes, sometimes overreacts. These moments do not negate his growth. They reveal its limits. Morty accepts these limits gradually, without dramatization. Acceptance does not mean surrender. Morty continues to evaluate his actions and their alignment with his values. He adjusts where possible. He carries regret without letting it dominate. The multiverse offers endless opportunities for self-reproach. Morty chooses restraint instead. This restraint extends to how he interprets others. Exposure to infinite variation reduces his tendency to essentialize. He becomes less likely to assume fixed traits or intentions. He understands behavior as context-dependent. This understanding softens judgment even when behavior is harmful. Morty does not excuse harm, but he situates it within complexity. Complexity, however, does not become an excuse for inaction. Morty remains capable of drawing boundaries. He recognizes that understanding does not require tolerance of damage. This distinction becomes clearer over time. Morty learns to disengage from situations that consistently erode him, even when those situations are familiar. Familiarity itself becomes suspect. The multiverse teaches Morty that repetition does not guarantee safety. Patterns can persist even when harmful. Morty learns to evaluate familiarity critically. Comfort is no longer assumed to be benign. This awareness complicates attachment, but it also prevents stagnation. As his experience deepens, Morty becomes more attentive to internal signals: fatigue, irritation, numbness. These signals function as data rather than weaknesses. Morty learns to interpret them as indicators of capacity. When signals intensify, he adjusts behavior rather than pushing through blindly. This self-regulation is learned through trial rather than instruction. The multiverse does not teach gently. Lessons are rarely spaced or reinforced intentionally. Morty pieces them together through accumulation. He does not always recognize learning as it happens. Understanding often arrives later in fragments, detached from the events that prompted it. This delayed understanding shapes Morty's relationship with memory. Memories do not serve as lessons in the traditional sense. They function as references. Morty recalls how situations felt more than what conclusions they produced. These feelings inform future responses indirectly. Learning becomes embodied rather than conceptual. Embodiment anchors Morty in the present. When abstraction threatens to pull him away, sensation brings him back. This anchoring does not solve problems. It stabilizes perception. Morty relies on it increasingly, even when he cannot articulate why. The multiverse also alters Morty's tolerance for spectacle. Extreme events lose their novelty. Excessive stimuli become background noise. Morty's attention shifts towards subtler changes: tone, pacing, absence. He notices when something does not happen as much as when it does. These absences carry meaning. Silence becomes meaningful, not empty, but containing. Morty learns to sit with silence without demanding resolution. This capacity grows slowly. Early silence felt threatening. Later silence feels neutral. Occasionally it feels restorative. The multiverse does not provide many opportunities for stillness. Morty takes them when they appear. This stillness allows reflection without urgency. Morty does not seek answers during these moments. He allows thoughts to pass without forcing coherence. This non-demanding attention contrasts sharply with the constant pressure to react elsewhere. It offers relief without escape. Over time, Morty's emotional life becomes less volatile but more textured. Peaks and valleys flatten slightly, but nuances increase. He distinguishes between subtle forms of discomfort and ease. This sensitivity does not increase suffering. It refines perception. Morty experiences more, without amplifying intensity. The multiverse does not acknowledge this refinement. It continues indifferent to internal change. Morty adapts by decoupling growth from recognition. He no longer expects validation. Growth becomes private. This privacy protects it from distortion. Despite this inward turn, Morty does not become isolated. He remains engaged with others, though more selectively. He values interactions that allow mutual presence rather than performance. These interactions are rare, but when they occur, they feel grounding. Morty does not analyze them. He experiences them. Experience becomes the primary currency of meaning, not interpretation, not outcome, not legacy. The multiverse dilutes all of those. Experience remains immediate and undeniable. Morty leans into this immediacy. It does not make existence easier. It makes it manageable. The ongoing effect of the multiverse on Morty is not transformation into something beyond human, but a deepening of human limitation under extreme conditions. Morty learns how much can be carried, how much must be set down, and how much can be reshaped. These lessons are not complete. They evolve as conditions change. From Morty's perspective, the multiverse is not an expanding horizon. It is a surrounding pressure. It shapes posture, movement, and breath. Morty adjusts continuously, rarely comfortably, but persistently. Within the vast recursive structure of Rick and Morty, Morty's experience remains anchored in the personal. He does not seek to master infinity. He seeks to remain intact within it. That intactness is not absolute. It bends, strains, and occasionally fractures. Morty repairs it imperfectly, again and again. There is no final repair. There is only maintenance. And in that maintenance, carried out quietly and without acknowledgement, Morty sustains a form of meaning that does not depend on scale, certainty, or permanence. It depends only on continued presence. In a universe that does not require this presence, Morty's persistence becomes the clearest expression of how the multiverse feels to him.